So far we've only seen Babel compiling our module importing and exporting with CommonJS. CommonJS being what we're pretty much used to at this point with Node.js itself. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how we can use AMD, UMD, and SystemJS with Babel and take a look at the different syntaxes. So kind of defining what those are and the strengths and potentially weaknesses of all three of them. Before I do, I just wanted to show some great documentation. If you're curious about the other ways that you can write the import and export statements, definitely check out the MDM doc on import and export. So here we see a couple of syntaxes that we haven't looked at, like for example combining multiple import types right there and using aliases for importing certain things. Just sort of non-essential stuff, but nice to know that you can do it. And again, if you ever forget the syntax, you can always check this page out. The export page is also interesting. A couple things we didn't look at was syntax like that, or for example, doing aliases for what we export. But it's not incredibly vital. You're not going to be using the more specialized versions of these statements very often, but it's good to know the reference in case you're ever curious about what you can do. Anyway, let's go ahead and close that out, and let's take a look at the ES2015 preset in Babel. So this is the preset that we've been using. And again, a preset in Babel is just a collection of plugins. It's just an easy way to bring in a bunch of plugins. And pretty much all these plugins should look familiar, at least as far as what ES2515 feature they add support for. So for example, you have arrow functions. So if all you wanted to do is transform arrow functions, you just use this plugin and so on. The reason I'm showing this is because of this right here, transform ES2015 modules CommonJS. So that shouldn't come as really a surprise that the ES2015 preset is receiving the module, the CommonJS module translator. Because as you saw by default, it turned into all our modules turned into CommonJS modules. However, there are multiple other modules packages we can use. So if I hop over into the plugins page and I just do a Control F on modules, we see this entire section with these 4 different module systems that we can use. We can use AMD, CommonJS, SystemJS, and UMD. So let's go ahead and install all 4 of these plugins. Each of the plugin is going to be named Babel-plugin- its name. So for example, the ES2015 modules AMD, the package name in npm is Babel plugin transform ES2015 modules AMD. So it's kind of long, but such is life. So let's go ahead and install the 3 of these that we're missing, and then I'll show you guys how to configure them so that we tell Babel which one we want to use, and then we'll take a look at the difference between each bit of syntax. So moving this window off to the side here, I'm going to open up my command line window, which is up here. And so let's go ahead and do npm install, and then I'm going to do npm install Babel plugin transform ES2015 modules AMD, and then save dev. And then I'm going to do this also for UMD and also for SystemJS. So I'm just going to hit the up arrow, and I'm going to bring in UMD now. So all I did was changed AMD to UMD. And then let's bring in SystemJS. Now, by installing these plugins, nothing's going to happen yet because we haven't told Babel to use these plugins. Now, when we tell Babel to use one of these module plugins, it's going to overwrite the existing CommonJS plugin that it's currently using by default. So to do that, I'm going to come in here to my Babel RC file, and I'm going to go ahead and add another property. And the property I'm going to be adding is, not surprisingly, called plugins. Now, plugins is an array, just like presets is. And it's an array of strings of all the plugins we want to use. Now, you have to have the plugins installed first before you can do this. And for the plugins, I'm going to pass in transform ES2015 modules, and let's go ahead and do AMD this time. So the first module, the first format we're going to look at in this video is AMD. We've already seen CommonJS, so I mean, hey, you can look at your Gulp file, and Gulp file is a CommonJS module using the require function. to import its dependencies. But now we're going to take a look at AMD. Now, AMD stands for Asynchronous Module Definition. AMD and CommonJS are very, very different from each other in how they work. CommonJS is synchronous. So for example, if we look at a CommonJS module such as gulpfile.js, we see that we require these modules in, but we require them synchronously, meaning they are required in serial. The entire file is loaded before the return statement happens. And this is great for something like a server or a script or something like that. We can see more examples of that if I pop open public scripts and look at application.js. You see how we're just requiring things in. And the problem with that is, like, let's say, for example, right here, we have two files. Now, let's say we want the browser to load both of these files at the same time. Well, if we have synchronous execution, we have an issue, because we'll have to wait for this entire model's user store to get loaded by the browser before we can get to line 5, where it requests this user's controller file. So it's all synchronous. And that can be great on the server, but it's not so great on the client, where it'll take time to go out and request these files. So we would want the browser to request model's user store and then controller's user controller at the same time. And then when it's done downloading both of these, oh, and also libutil and script, when it's done loading all of these in parallel, then it lets the script continue to execute. So that's the behavior that we'll generally want when we're working on the browser. It's not the behavior we want when we're working on the server, though. And that's why CommonJS and AMD both exist. Neither one is better than the other, but AMD is generally going to be used on the browser, and CommonJS is generally going to be used on the client. So let's take a look at the syntax. I'm going to go ahead and just type up here. I'm going to type in gulp dev:/scripts and hit enter. And that is going to take that file from a CommonJS format and turn it into an AMD format. So let's pick it apart. So you'll notice quite a few things changed. The require statements went away. You'll notice that our code is still the same. However, the require statements got taken away and put here at the top. So what's going on here? Well, when we define a AMD module, there's a couple ways to do it, but one of the most common ways is to do it like this. We invoke the define function. Now, the define function isn't something that's built into a browser or built into a runtime. It's one of those things that we're going to have to define ourselves. We're going to have to create our define function by importing a library that defines it for us. So like require.js defines a define function. This isn't a built-in standardized JavaScript thing. This is a convention for the AMD specification. Now, the AMD specification doesn't necessarily tell us which module loader to use, but we have to use a module loader that understands the AMD specification in order to load this module. So as you can see, it changed quite a bit. So now we have a define function that defines a module, and then we have an array of strings. And those are our modules. Those are all the modules that are imported by application.js. And then after that, we have a callback. And that callback receives the return value from these modules. So instead of doing, var ble equals require whoa stuff equals require things, which is synchronous, we instead would define something, pass in our dependencies, whoa and things, and then pass in a callback function. And that's how you define a module in AMD. So the whoa variable is whatever the whoa module returned, and the things variable is whatever the things module returned. So it can be loaded asynchronously, because the runtime can get a list of all of these scripts that are needed for this module and load them all at once. And then once it's done, it'll invoke this callback. So yeah, not terribly exciting, but makes a whole lot of sense and makes a AMD loader much more appropriate for the browser. So if we looked at script.js, for example, script.js just has this code here. This is all the code that was originally there before we transpiled it. But then we got the define function here with an empty array of dependencies followed by our function. And our user store. Now, user store is interesting. It defines right here, just like what we saw before, and it grabs its dependency, in this case, user. But we also have this exports thing. When you have an AMD module that accepts exports, that export variable is what's going to be used to, well, export the content or export whatever the module needs to export. So the exports isn't quite like a exports in CommonJS, where the exports in CommonJS is this global thing that's always everywhere. The exports here is actually specifically required in from whatever module loader we're using, and then we just attach variables to it. So another really cool thing about AMD that you should see right off the bat here is everything in the entire file was collapsed into this one function, this one closure, meaning we're no longer diluting the global scope. When we define a function in AMD, in the AMD format, we define it inside of this callback function so it doesn't leak, it doesn't ever get attached to the window object, for example. Okay, so that's AMD and CommonJS. Those are going to be the two big ones that you're going to hear about all the time. Many packages will use either CommonJS or AMD, but there's actually a third format. Well, there's 4 total, but there's an interesting third format, and that's called UMD. So let's go ahead and open up Babel RC, and I'm going to change this this plugin to using Transform ES 2015 Modules UMD. And then I'm going to hop back over to application.js, and I'm going to run dev scripts. Well, looks like it got a whole lot uglier. UMD is the universal module definition. UMD is AMD plus CommonJS. It's really just a sort of convention, I guess. So what happens with Babel is Babel throws together this this header up here, this nasty-looking header that does a bunch of different things. And the interesting thing about it is it'll work in both CommonJS and AMD. So you see up here, it checks to see if AMD is installed. If it is, then it uses the define syntax. Otherwise, if the exports global is available, meaning if we're in a CommonJS runtime such as Node, if the export's is available, it'll assume we're in a CommonJS environment, in which case it'll use the require syntax. Otherwise, it will go ahead and export it globally, as if it was just a script we added in. Now, a lot of libraries use the UMD header so that basically it can be loaded whether we have an AMD loader or a CommonJS loader. So there's not a whole lot else to say about it other than just to repeat myself, UMD is compatible with both AMD and CommonJS. So if we looked at script, we still have that huge header up here. And same with user store, still has that huge header. We still get our exports, and that UMD figures out how to handle that and get that to work properly in both environments. All right, there's one more format to talk about. So just to recap what we've been saying, the import-export syntax in ES 2015 currently does nothing. We need a module loader in order to handle that, and we need to specify a module format. Now, and the reason why we have to use a module loader is because there's no standard built-in ES 2015 module loader yet. But there was a proposal for one. There is a proposal for one in the committee right now. And that's going to be known as SystemJS. So currently there is a module loader that does understand SystemJS. It's not a formalized, it's not yet formalized right now. But the SystemJS polyfill available, it comes very close or exactly replicates that specification. And in one day, be it 5-10 years from now, this is pretty much going to be how modules are going to be loaded. So let's take a look at the SystemJS specification, or not specification, but an example of it. I'm going to hop over into my Babel RC, and I'm going to change the module loader to SystemJS. And then I'm going to pop over to application.js, and I'm going to run my dev scripts. And let's take a look at that. So SystemJS uses this system object, which, again, hopefully one day is going to be built into all of our browsers. And it basically behaves very similarly to AMD. We do system.register, we pass in our dependencies, and then we have our, we pass in a function that has an exports, and then we return an object, a module object, with a bunch of these different properties on it. So like execute contains all of our code in here, and then we have our imports and we have our exports and all that fun stuff. So like let's take a look at script. Script is really simple. We system register it with no dependencies, and then we return a JavaScript object, and the only thing that's interesting here is the execute function that prints that out. Or we can take a look at how exports are done. If I hop over into Models User Store, we can see here that when I export my module user store, we use the export function. So as you see, the export function is accepted by this closure, and then when we export the user store, we just invoke it. And yeah, there's not really a whole lot more to say about System.js because it's straightforward. I'm not going to get into the actual specification or anything like that. And we will be taking a look at a module loader that supports System.js. But anyway, so now you guys have seen the different module formats we can use. AMD, CommonJS, SystemJS, or UMD. And the question is which one to use? Well, the answer to that is which module loader are you going to use? Fortunately, most module loaders, or all module loaders, can support any format you throw at it. Sometimes you have to tweak it a little bit in certain circumstances. But generally, like Webpack and Browserify, for example, will natively support your UMD or your AMD or your CommonJS modules. JSPM will support all of them. Require.js can be made to work with them. I mean, I don't know. Again, it's up to you. It's up to what module loader you're going to be using. So, yeah. Those are the formats, and that's how they relate to each other. I hope this cleared up, I guess, maybe some confusion some people have in regards to the different formats. I know it's very odd, but to have so many different formats and to try to do the pros and cons of each one, but you know how JavaScript is. There's a million ways to do everything. So I think that pretty much wraps up this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.